Hey, and welcome back to the research process. This is episode 4, in which we'll be talking about designing an experiment. Let's go ahead and get started. Again, this is part of the CSR-x episode series. We have a lot in this series. Previously, we talked about finding a research question, conducting a literature review. The last episode was establishing a hypothesis, and this episode is about designing an experiment. First, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Kate Padua. I'm a rising senior at John W. North High School. My research focuses on engineering solutions based in ecology, as well as some sociology and psychology. Most recently, I placed with my team at the state level at the California Envirothon 2024. Let's move on to some learning outcomes. In this lesson, we'll be exploring how to design an experiment. First, we'll start off by defining what an experiment is and reviewing the checklist of an experiment. So let's go ahead and get started. What is an experiment? The experiment provides the data, numbers, results, etc., which are used in the project to reach a conclusion. A good experiment is one that accurately pertains to the question proposed. It should give data that refutes or supports a hypothesis, or if you watched the last episode, we talked about a null hypothesis. It has an appropriate sample size, so making sure that you're conducting your experiment appropriately and conducting your experiment the correct amount of times. And making sure it is also easily reproducible. We'll talk about that in a bit. We'll talk about being able to reproduce your experiment and the importance of that. So why do we need an experiment? What is so important about the experiment? Well, the importance of the experiment is that it is at the heart of your research, probably one of the most important parts of your research project. It's important that it's conducted thoroughly. A comprehensive and detailed experiment allows you to gather exhaustive evidence to answer your research question. So you want a lot of evidence in your research so that by the time you come to your conclusion, it's backed up by a lot of information and reliable information. Again, a good experiment should strengthen your conclusion and aid others in their own research. And again, we'll talk about that in a bit, about being able to replicate your experiment. So how do you design an experiment? Well, first, you're going to want to consider the scientific method. Designing an experiment starts with observation. Observation is what's going to lead your experiment. This observation is what often leads to the development or hypothesis or research question which guides your experiment. I like to call the observation the point of interest. Basically, what's going to get you started or interested in this topic to further explore it in your research question. Humans are great at seeing patterns. We're very perceptive of when something's different or some certain phenomenon is going on and there's a pattern occurring. The purpose of the research and the goal of your experiment is to establish and find the why of this is happening. A scientist or researcher use an experiment to find a measurable outcome that supports or refutes their hypothesis. The thing that they got interested in, they're trying to find some measurable evidence to help support their hypothesis or what they think is going to happen. For example, when observing plants, a scientist could hypothesize that with greater sunlight, a plant will grow taller. Next, you want to consider the components of an experiment. We talked about this in the last episode, but hypothesis should contain an independent variable and dependent variable. So, of course, your research in your experiment should contain also the independent and dependent variable. In the case of plants and sunlight, to use the same example, the independent variable is the amount of sunlight the plants receive. The dependent variable is what's measured, the height of the plants. Again, the dependent variable is the thing that is measured. This could be temperature, volume, decibels, height, width, frequency. The independent variable is the thing that's being changed, pH, temperature, the amount of something. Next, you'll want to consider details. Before you're conducting your experiment, it's important to outline your steps in a clear and detailed fashion. This is the procedure that we'll be talking about in a second. I want to emphasize the important concept of replication. It's incredibly important in raising the confidence in the scientific merit of your results. Making sure your procedure is detailed is incredibly important. It should be done with lots of care, and you should outline all the steps that you're going to take when you're taking your experiment. This is because when others want to repeat your experiment, they'll be able to. If a result from a study can be found in another, the conclusion becomes more reliable. However, they can only properly repeat your experiment if you give lots of detailed steps on how to conduct the same experiment. Excuse me. So talking about procedure, you're going to want to write your steps out clearly and explicitly. If you've ever watched The Great British Baking Show, it's essentially the opposite of the technical challenge, where their instructions are very vague and up to interpretation, and bakers are left to their own devices. You want to be the opposite of that. Be very explicit and very clear of the steps that you're taking and what the steps that other people will be taking. Make a list of necessary elements and components. So the ingredients that you're going to be used. Make sure you have all the parts listed, all the parts that you're going to be using in your experiment. Conduct the experiment and take notes as you go. Make sure you're collecting the data in organized fashion, storing it in tables, writing it down. Sometimes things don't always go the way that we planned. So if something happens or you make some certain changes or tweaks, make sure you write that down too. Make sure you're also writing any of your observations during the process. It's not always about the end result. Sometimes you have to take note of what's happening in between to further study the relationship between your variables. Possibly you're going to want to conduct the experiment multiple times. Yes, you will want to have a sample size or a sample pool, but you might want to do that more than once as well, just to make sure that your first trial wasn't a fluke or anything like that. Lastly, you're going to want to draw the conclusion from your experiment with the data. This conclusion should support or refute your hypothesis, or again, like we talked about before, have a null hypothesis. Sometimes you find that there is no relationship between your variables. Next, I want to talk about how to gauge the validity of an experiment. Evaluating your experiment. Again, an experiment should be reproducible. If future scientists want to redo your experiment, they should be able to with ease and lots of clarity. An experiment should have a control group. It is if one group is changing the pH of the water, the control group may contain distilled water at a neutral pH. An experiment should have an appropriate sample size. The larger the sample size, the more accurate the experiment will be. Of course, sample size should be within reason. For example, if I wanted to collect data on my school's favorite school lunch, as an example, it would not be appropriate or necessary for me to survey every single student at my high school. Instead, it would be more reasonable to randomly select 25 students from each grade to have a sample of 100 students and gauge their opinions to make assumptions or conclusion about the general population of my choice, which is my high school. Next, I want to talk about experimental design. Experimental design is the design of a task that aims to explain the cause for variations or anomalies in a set of data. It is aimed to organize, conduct, and interpret the results of an experiment in a really efficient way. So this is going to help with your experiment and becoming more accurate and thorough and being able to go through large amounts of data that often have really complex relationships in a more efficient way. There are 3 types of experimental designs that we'll be talking about today. The first is artificial intelligence analysis, computer-aided design, and systematic literature review. And all of these things are helping conduct your experiment in a much more efficient way with different aids and different tools. And they're designed in this way to thoroughly go through information in a way that a human analyst may not be able to, or other methods of analyzing may be restricted. So first, I want to talk about artificial intelligence review. AI has the ability to learn normal patterns and variations, so you can tell an AI what's normal and what exactly we see typically, and it can do this very accurately. And then it can find the correlations of the anomalies that it does find much faster than a human analyst can. So again, if you're giving an AI a certain pattern or a certain variation, then when it's being fed information or data, it can point out anomalies or anything that's strange, and then find out the certain correlations, like when are these anomalies happening. This is really important because a lot of time data sets or experiments can be really complex interactions, and they can take a great deal of time, resources, and really little room for error to evaluate and draw conclusions from that data. For example, AI in drug testing can look at previous trials and recommend optimal doses. So it can look at like really, really large sets of data, and it can also organize it for you, and maybe you can see that in a particular age group, these certain symptoms seem to be happening when they take this particular drug. Another example, maybe you've heard of it, is the AlphaFold. It's a computer learning system that has been able to predict the 3D shape of proteins based on amino acids. And we've been trying to do this as humans on our own for the benefit of finding cures for things such as sickle cell disease and breast cancer, and has been very important in predicting the shape of these. AlphaFold was able to predict essentially every 3D form of proteins based on the amino acids that we fed it and the information that we gave it. Similarly, I want to talk about computer-aided design. Computer-aided design is a software which creates a 2D or 3D model of a design. Computer-aided design models are able to be scaled easily and altered to fit the needs of the designer. Architects and engineers use computer-aided design to create accurate models. For example, we can give computer information about the certain qualities of a material, the strength, how much force it can withstand, what kind of shapes are they usually stronger in because of their molecular structure, and all sorts of other factors that a typical building might be withstanding. We can simulate with computer-aided design. The main goal of computer-aided design is to reduce the number of trials we have to do by optimizing parameters and resources. So we don't have to test and break a bunch of materials because we can simulate the same characteristics of that material in computer-aided design. Computer-aided design can also help us maximize and optimize the test that we're going to do. It can find what structures and what ratios, things like that make those structures the strongest. A real-world example, if you've heard about it, are these animal robots. They're called xenobots that have been coming into development, I believe, recently. They're basically very small, only like less than a millimeter size robots that we can control. And the process began when scientists made a bunch of simple computer simulated like creatures made out of little building blocks. And these little building blocks in the computer program were able to either contract or stay the same. And while these little blocks contracted, these little creatures were basically able to move on a flat surface, and the computer was able to simulate that, then moving around. With the help of a supercomputer, they were able to test millions of these little shapes and forms and combinations of these little blocks to figure out which ones walked the best, which ones could move the best. And computer-aided design can adjust by finding the shapes and forms that would meet specific criteria that we're looking for, maybe such as speed and maneuverability or stability, and which one has the best mix of those qualities that we're looking for. The supercomputer was able to go through millions and find like the top 5 shapes and forms and combinations of those little blocks that were able to move the best. And this was extremely helpful in, and we can use these small little robots that we simulated in the computer design, make them in real life by using different cells, and we can use that to go inside the body and track down cancer or take down certain diseases, things like that. So that's the benefit of computer-aided design in a real situation there. Next, I want to talk about systematic literature review. This is a review of several studies that comes to a conclusion. In systematic literature review, you're looking at several studies relating to the same topic or issue, and you examine them and you draw a conclusion. Since several studies are examined independently of each other and possibly critiqued, they become reliable, and the final conclusion should be a very accurate statement of fact. Essentially, you're looking at the experiments that other people have done, looking at their conclusions and drawing conclusions from those. So especially taking experiments that are done at different times by lots of different groups and different people, you can take a pretty diverse set of conclusions from those studies and develop your own conclusions, because those are so diverse, and your conclusion will be fairly strong and be backed up by lots of different points. Just some action items, and I want to make sure that everyone is doing. Mentees, after discussing with your cohort group, make sure you complete the following action items by the end of phase 1. You're going to want to fill out this form to submit your research question. So after you're done learning about how to form a research question, you will be expected to submit your research question to the Google form, just so we make sure that everyone's up to date and on track. Just some final closing thoughts. Experimentation is an extremely important skill that will benefit you throughout your life. Not everyone will design an experiment every day of their lives, but curiosity drives experimentation and fuels the desire to learn. That same desire to learn is very important and will help us in all future endeavors. In addition, there are many careers in which designing experiments is a very important aspect of the job. Whether you hope to design experiments every day or you just want to learn about the world around you, knowing the ins and outs of experimentation is a very valuable skill to keep for the rest of your life. And we'll be talking about all the ins and outs and benefits of experimentation in your selected cohort. So I hope you guys have fun with that. Thank you. This concludes the end of episode 4. We hope to see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for watching. Special thanks to Zanabu for helping me prepare this presentation. Thank you.